It's getting near Christmas, in case you hadn't noticed. And it was weird. We were in Lanzarote a few weeks ago, and it's kind of weird when you're in like 80 degrees and there's Christmas decorations and trees up. It feels strange. But one of the signs of Christmas coming is that they start to put on the Christmas movies and the carols and all. And I don't know what your favorite Christmas movie is, but there's a couple that are always guaranteed. Love Actually is always guaranteed to be on. And a personal favorite in our house is The Holiday. Anybody like The Holiday? It's one of those, you could just watch it over. I mean, and I say that as a red-blooded male who generally won't admit that I like rom-coms. There's just something about that movie that every year you kind of want to watch. We love romantic movies. Gone with the Wind, or some of the classics, Ghost. Pretty Woman, which is kind of weird as a romantic movie when you consider the context of it. An Officer and a Gentleman, Titanic, and Sleepless in Seattle, which I'll not show any clips of ever. They're in the top 50 greatest love stories of all time. And I know some of you men like love stories. You might go to the cinema under duress and you'll say, she made me go. And then when you're crying, you'll say, it's my allergies, I've got hay fever. But we all love a good love story. There's something about watching two people fall in love, especially against all the odds. See the hero ride in on his white horse, sweep the damsel in distress off her feet, or to see the prince kiss the sleeping beauty and bring her back to life. And the story we're looking at over the next 4 weeks or so is, some people would say it's one of the greatest love stories ever told. It's in only 4 chapters, and yet it expresses so much of what real love should look like. But like all love stories, there's different scenes. And you never get to the happy ending without some of the drama and messes and all of the stuff that happens at the start to make you think, how will these two ever fall in love? And that's what we're going to find with the book of Ruth today. So don't despair at the end of the first scene today, okay? Because we haven't got to the end. So let's look at the backdrop. Ruth 1 and 2. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. Say that 5 times quickly. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites, say that 5 times, from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab to live there. So this takes place, it talks about the days of the judges. That was the 12th to the 10th century before Christ, and it wasn't a good time in the history of Israel. So God brings his people out of Egypt. He brings them into the promised land under Joshua. Remember, Moses is dead. Joshua leads them, and now Joshua is dead, and they don't have godly leadership. They've forgotten all that God did for them in delivering them out of slavery and oppression under Egypt for 400 years. And over time, they begin to drift. Their hearts begin to drift. And we see this cycle, this downward spiral throughout the book of Judges. And basically what happens is this, is that they rebel against God, they start to follow other gods, they fall into immorality and idolatry. Things don't go well for them. God lifts his blessing, his protection off them. Either other nations come in and defeat them in war, or they go into famine, because God had told them in Deuteronomy 28 if they followed other gods, this would happen. But somehow we think that we're the exception to what God says in his word. And so they disobey God, and then bad things happen. God's discipline of his children. God removes his blessing, his protection. And then they cry out to God and say, we're really sorry, God. God sends a deliverer called a judge. That's why we've got the book of Judges. People like Othniel and Samson and different people like that. And they deliver them from oppression. They bring them back to God, and the whole cycle starts again. Things go well for a while. They have victory over their enemies. The famine is gone. There's food in the barns. And then they forget about God, and they go into the cycle again. Because the book of Judges ends with this phrase: There was no king in the land at the time, and every person did what was right in their own eyes. That's the very last verse in the book of Judges. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That's the culture we're living in today, isn't it? If it doesn't hurt you, it's all right. You know, as long as it makes me happy, it's all right. It doesn't matter about truth. It doesn't matter about standards. It doesn't matter about morality. It doesn't matter about right or wrong. If I think it's right, it's right. You might not think it's right, but that's your truth, and I've got my truth. And that's the culture that they were living in today, or in that day. And it says this: there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah. It's interesting that Bethlehem, the actual word Bethlehem means this: house of bread. There's a famine in the house of bread. When there's a famine in the house of bread, something's gone wrong. The reason there's a famine again is because of their disobedience. It reminds me of the story I tell often about when I was a teenager and Kentucky Fried Chicken, as it was called then, opened in Portadown. And every time I went down, they were out of chicken. And I eventually says, just stop, just call yourselves Kentucky Fried because there's no chicken. It'd be like going to McDonald's every day and we've no Big Macs. That's kind of what was happening here. In the house of bread, there was no bread. The church is a house of bread. The church is a place where people come to get fed spiritually. People come to get nourished. People come hungry to encounter God. People come hungry to experience God, to be filled for the week ahead. And yet, sadly, in too many churches, what they're given is candy floss every week instead of bread. And there's nothing wrong with a wee bit of candy floss, but you can't live on it. And so they leave starving, they leave sick. And the problem is that starving people will eat anything. I don't know if you've ever been really hungry, like really, really hungry, where there's something in the bin that's been there for a day or so, and you start thinking, that looks actually quite appetizing right now. Like most of us, our biggest problem isn't starvation, it's the other. Elimelech and his family are in the house of bread, but they're starving. And starving people will eat anything. And that's what happens here. So Elimelech and his family, they do a relocation. And he decides to move his family to Moab because that's where the food is. And in theory, this seems like a good idea. When you're hungry, you go where the food is. However, this is not a good idea for a number of reasons. The first one is this: we never read that God told them to go to Moab. See, there's nothing wrong with moving house. There's nothing wrong to moving to a new location. But God had very much set in place the parameters and the boundaries and the borders where he would bless his people, and that was in the land of Israel, formerly the land of Canaan. And that's where God's presence was. That's where the synagogues were. That's where God's people worshipped. He never told his people to go outside of that. Never does it say God told them. You see, when we read Genesis 12, it said God spoke to Abraham and told him to leave. We don't have that here. It was their own idea because every man did what was right in his own eyes. And Moab was not a nice place. It's not on your TripAdvisor top 10 places to go. It was just across Israel's border. It was a pagan nation. It was a nation that came about as the result of an incestuous relationship between Lot. Remember Lot in the Old Testament? Lot and his daughter produced a child, and that's how Moab came about. It was outside the borders of the promised land. They were Israel's enemies. They were pagan and perverted. They worshipped idols and false gods. There wasn't much that would make you want to go to Moab. A bit like Newry without Buttercrane and the Key Shopping Centre. John, keep on driving. There's not much to... If you're from Newry here, I don't mean the part that you're from. I mean the rest, the city of Newry. The city of Newry. It was a pretty dodgy place. It was the sort of place that you just kept going. You passed through. You didn't stay there for very long. But they're driven by hunger to the wrong place. They're driven by pressure. Pressure on Elimelech as a husband and as a father to provide for his family. And I've been thinking about pressure this week. When the pressure is on, we don't make good decisions. How do you handle pressure? Some of us are better at handling pressure than others. I've found I can handle certain types of pressure really well, and other types of pressure I get really annoyed at. Like when really awful things happen, I tend to be fine. Like when our little boy Elijah closed his finger in a door when we lived in Port Stewart, and literally the top of his finger was hanging off by a thread, I'm completely fine. When other little smaller or less dramatic things happen, I tend to freak out a bit. We all handle pressure in different ways, and we all handle different pressures. And a lot of it can depend on where we're at in life. I found I don't handle pressure well when I'm tired. They say actually that you shouldn't make decisions under 4 conditions, or there's 4 times when you're likely to make a bad decision. And it's spelled out by the word halt, H-A-L-T, when you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. And I've found that in my own life. When I'm hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, and I would add 2 more to that, hurt and bored, I don't tend to make the right decisions. And yet there's sometimes when pivotal decisions are made that will impact our whole future. Most of the decisions you make today and tomorrow, they won't be big deals, what you have for breakfast, what you wear, whatever it is. But there's certain times in our lives when there's pivotal decisions that will affect our whole future. And one of them is where you will move your family. Now, if I were to live in Portadown, Paris, or Perth, that's not that big a deal. But in these days, for an Israelite to go to Moab, to a place that God had very clearly told him not to go, that was going to have consequences, because they were among a pagan people who didn't worship their God. They were among the enemies of God. There were no synagogues. There was nowhere for them to worship. There was no church for them to go to. And so that was going to impact their future. But he did it under pressure. I wonder if you're under pressure today. You know, as kids we have pressure. Pressure to fit in with friends. Pressure with exams, transfer tests. Then as you get older, pressure of finding somebody, a husband or a wife, if that's what you want. Pressure of getting a job, and then you get a promotion and there's more pressure. Pressure of family, and then when you have family, pressure of kids, pressure of providing. You buy stuff and there's a pressure of looking after it. There's bills and there's money. As you get older, you have elderly parents and there's the pressure of looking after them. There's a certain amount of pressure is okay. We need pressure, actually. Life without any pressure, it's a bit like when astronauts go to space, they need to maintain a certain pressure, or else their bodies just kind of go to pieces. I was preaching in Belfast last Sunday for 3 times, and when I got back about 10:30 last Monday night, and on Monday morning I went out to bring Elijah to school, and my neighbour across the road said, "You've got a flat tire." What's a flat tire? There's no pressure in it. It's no good because there's no pressure. Pressure keeps us going. Pressure keeps us moving. We need some pressure. Otherwise, we stagnate and keep growing and stop growing. We need blood pressure, but we don't need high blood pressure. We need resistance in life, but too much resistance can crush us. Too much pressure in a tire and it bursts. Sometimes the pressure has a purpose. Sometimes God uses pressure to move us in life. We've become settled and stagnant. We've become too comfortable in a place. And God will use pressure to push us. God will use pressure to relocate us. We read that in the book of Acts. What did Jesus say? Spread the gospel in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And yet by Acts chapter 8, they haven't left Jerusalem because it's a nice place to be. So what does God do? He sends persecution. He sends pressure. And we read that he scattered God's people all over the then known world, because sometimes God will use pressure to move us. We need pressure. Pressure presses, pressure squeezes, pressure proves us, and pressure moves us on. But too much pressure can crush us. It can make us do things that we wouldn't normally do, like go to Moab. The pressure here was hunger. They're driven by hunger. And so they move away. It's not like their whole life goal was to move to Moab, but they're moving away from famine. And I've discovered in life, and in my own life, that there's a difference between moving towards something and moving away from something. And this is actually quite an important concept to think about in life. that God generally, when he guides us, will guide us towards, not away. I would say 80% of the time God guides us towards something, and only about 20% does he guide us away. And the only reason we leave somewhere is because he's guided us towards. So when I went to Lurgan, I was guided towards there. When we moved to Dublin, we were guided towards there. However, when we left Dublin, we were guided away from there. God didn't tell us what was next, but he told us to move on. But then when we came to Craigavon here, we were guided towards here. And what I'm saying is this, that a lot of us will sometimes make decisions based in response to conditions that we don't like. And think, if I can just escape this location, if I can just get out of this job, if I can just leave this church, the grass will be greener on the other side of the Moab fence. And then we get to Moab and we realize that the issue wasn't there. The issues were some problems in here, and we've just carried them to a different place with us. And so when you're considering moving, when you're considering relocating, when you're considering leaving something behind, ask yourself this: what am I moving towards? Has God called me towards something, or am I just moving away from something that's uncomfortable? Because very often when you do that, you will just carry the problems with you. Let's keep reading, verses 3-5. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah, not Oprah, Orpah, and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So Naomi and Elimelech, we're told, have 2 sons. Mahlon means sick. Chilion means dying. Not the best names to call your kids. I know that New Old Testament names, like Joshua and Elijah and Moses and Noah, these are all kind of cool these days. If you're picking names for your kids, do not pick sick and dying. It's like bird flu and hepatitis. Come over here. It's not the best names for your kids. But they moved to Moab, and all is good for a while, because very often when we step out of the will of God, things go fine for a while, and we can almost start to believe that God's blessing is upon us. But very soon, it all starts to fall apart. Elimelech dies. We don't know how he dies. We don't know how long they were there when he died, but he died. But for Naomi, this was fine, because she still had 2 sons to provide for her. She had 2 daughters-in-law, Moabite women. God's people were forbidden in the Bible from marrying Moabite women, but let's be honest, when you're in Moab, what choice do you have? The pickings are slim, and so they go down to the coach, and they find these 2 Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, and they're better than the rest of them, they'll do, and they marry them. And so as long as she's got her 2 sons, things are good, but then it all starts to fall apart, because sick and die also. You'd never saw that coming, so you wouldn't sick and die. That was a real shocker that day in the house. It's like a bad episode of EastEnders right there. But in this patriarchal culture, this was a culture in which women very much depended on men for their livelihood, for provision and protection. Every day was Father's Day, I like to say, in this culture. It was all about men. The lineage, the wealth, the land all came through men. And so without men to continue, and they had no more children, without men, they had no hope and no future. They had no provision and no protection, and they had no life insurance. I often joke that if anything happens to me, please point the finger here first. Because when when Becky was pregnant with Elijah, I took out really good life insurance. And now and again, I feel like she's hoping for the certificate. And so I'm just telling you, should anything happen to me, please do point the finger at the front row, but not at my friend Vicky, at Becky, although Vicky might be the one too. But it's seriously, it's tragic. She buried her husband and her both sons. In half a verse, her life falls apart. In half a verse, just one line, she lost her husband, she lost both her sons. Sometimes life is like that, just in an instant, just in a conversation, just in a phone call, just in a test result. Everything falls apart, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. I remember there was a lady in our church in Dublin, Linda, And Linda had her husband and her son both murdered within the space of about a year of each other. During the gangland fights and battles down there, her husband was shot, her son was murdered, stabbed to death. And I remember talking to her and just the heartbreak that she experienced. Sometimes you can imagine burying a spouse, but nobody should have to bury their own children. But when you go to the wrong places and you stay longer than you should have stayed, and when you don't do what God tells you to do, things don't work out. The dream has become a nightmare. It's a bit like the prodigal son, isn't it? He goes off thinking everything's going to be good. And everything's good for a while. And then he ends up in the pig pen. And he decides to go home. When you go somewhere God has told you not to go, and when you do something God has told you not to do not expect God's blessing to go with you. And after a while, you're going to have to come home. But sometimes we're too stubborn and too proud. And so we stay where we are longer than we should. But Naomi eventually comes home. Look at verses 6 to 10. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." So things have changed back home. She's read on BBC News that there's now food in Bethlehem. And so she packs up her stuff, and along with her 2 daughters-in-law, Naomi and Ruth, Orpah and Ruth, she prepares to go home. It's a 7 to 10 day walk. And so they start off on this journey, and Naomi's quiet because she's got a lot on her mind. She's got a lot on her mind about her past, about her husband and losing her children. She's wondering how people will respond because she was never meant to go to Moab. She was a turncoat. She was a traitor. And then she's bringing these 2 girls back with her. They weren't exactly going to be welcome in Moab or in Israel. Moabite girls weren't exactly that popular among Israeli women, let's just say. They would have been immigrants, foreigners. There was no way to support them. And so she's got all of this in mind, and eventually she turns to them and she says, "Orpah, Ruth, what are you doing here? Go home, go back. I have nothing to offer you. Go back home. I have absolutely nothing to offer you. You've been really good daughters-in-law to me, and I appreciate it, but I have nothing to give to you. At least back home you might meet other men, you might get husbands, you might have children, you might have a future, but don't waste your time with me." And they said, "No, we're going with you." Look at verse 11. But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you wait another 18 years? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more better for me than for you." And look at this phrase, "because the Lord's hand has turned against me." That's a key verse, and we're going to continue to look at that in a moment or two. The Lord's hand has turned against me. You see, it's one thing to say that I made wrong choices and those wrong choices had bad consequences. It's another thing to say life was just hard. There were some circumstances in life and I've ended up in a bad place. And then it's a completely different thing to say God did this to me. This is God's fault. I'm blaming God. And we'll see this expressed more fully in a few moments. Verse 14. At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. Didn't take a lot of convincing right there. But Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. And we've got these beautiful, beautiful words. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Literally, the literal Hebrew means she stopped talking to her. She just realized that there was no point anymore, and so she's silent. And so we have this mixture of genuine concern for her daughters-in-law. But there's also the sense of, I think, where for Naomi, pain makes her want to isolate herself. Pain does that, doesn't it, sometimes? Hurt does that. We just want to be on our own. We don't want others to see us broken and wounded and in a mess, crying, sobbing. We don't want to have to tell others what we've done. We just want to crawl into a corner. Remember when Elijah reaches the end of himself, it says he left his servant behind and went into the wilderness on his own. I don't know about you, but when I'm not in a good place, I tend to isolate myself. I tend to cut myself off from people. Some of you do that. Some of you, when you're not in a good place, you stop coming to church. You stop fellowshipping with people. You stop going to small group. And that seems like the right thing to do, and yet it's very possibly the worst thing we can do, because we try to suffer in silence and solitude. We push away the people when we need them the most. And Orpah leaves. She goes back home. She goes back to a pagan nation and her false gods. And what struck me is both Orpah and Ruth cried, but they both responded differently. They both cried and said, we're going to stay, but one stayed and one left. Just because somebody cries doesn't mean that they're sincere. Just because somebody cries doesn't mean that you believe every word they say. Orpah was crying and saying, I'm never leave you, as she's waiting for the bus to come along and take her back to Moab, to the place of godlessness and false gods. And we never hear about Orpah again. There's no book of Orpah in here. Because it took risk and faith to go with Naomi. It took risk and faith. And you know what? People whose lives aren't characterized by risk and faith don't have stories worth telling. But there's a book of Ruth in here. And so she goes back home. But Ruth, she's got a different spirit. Not everyone who starts the journey with you will finish it with you. Orpah started the journey but didn't finish it. And that's important for us to know in life. That there's people who we think will be with us all through life, but they don't. There comes a time when they walk away, and that's okay. And here's what I've discovered as I've gone through the pain of seeing people who I honestly thought I would grow old with walk away. That there's nothing that they have that God needs for my future. That people who leave you along the journey, they don't have anything that God needs for your future, because otherwise he would have kept them with you. But God needs Ruth for Naomi's future, and so Ruth stays with her. Ruth has a completely different spirit. She clings to her mother-in-law. And I know we've got loads of mother-in-law jokes and all of that. But she's stuck like glue, and she says, I'm going nowhere. She leaves the comfort and security and familiarity behind of her family, of her culture, of her religion. Her chances of marrying are next to zero. She's going to be an immigrant, an outsider. She's probably going to be despised. She's no hope, no money, no prospects. And yet she says, wherever you go, I'm going to go. The language here is a vow, it's a covenant. The word that she uses in the Hebrew is davak. And it's the same word that we read in Genesis 2:24 when God is describing the covenant of marriage. That a man will leave his family and a wife will leave her family, and the two will davak. They will cling together. I love officiating weddings. It's one of my favorite things to do in this job. It genuinely is. I love it. And I love the rehearsals. because it all becomes very real. Because when we're doing a rehearsal, I give each of them a ring. I normally take mine off, and I find a ring for the bride, and I get them to stare at each other and to go through the vows, reminding them that they're not married on that particular night, so save it for a few more days. But nearly without exception, they tear up at the rehearsal as they start to make these vows to each other. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. And that's the love and loyalty expressed here. That's the sacrifice and service and selflessness that Ruth expresses here. She says, your God will be my God. We don't know if she's ever said that before. But what she's saying is, I'm leaving my old gods, my old pagan gods behind, and I want to follow Yahweh. This is her moment of conversion. She's saying, I only have one God now, and his name is Yahweh. Verse 19, we're nearly there. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. You know, it's funny. She's got all this theological language right. The Lord, the Almighty. But she just doesn't like him. He's brought misfortune. He's afflicted me. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So it's been over 10 years, and she gets back, and there's a bit of a stir. People are saying, is that Naomi? And my first thought was this, that did they really have to leave in the first place? Because if there's everybody who recognizes her, not everybody died in the famine. People survived. They didn't have to leave, but they chose to leave. And people say, is that you, Naomi? It kind of looks like you, but you've got older, and there's just something, you just seem a little bit angry and bitter. And she says, don't call me Naomi. Naomi means pleasant. Call me Mara, because Mara means bitter. Because the Lord Almighty has made my life very bitter. Again, she's saying God did this. This is God's fault. This isn't my fault. It wasn't my choice to go somewhere God told me never to go. It wasn't my fault that I did something God told me to do. Told me never to do. It's his fault. And then look at what she says. I thought that was interesting. She says, I went away full. Really? I'd never noticed this before until the last few days. She says, I went away full. Why did she leave in the first place? Because there was famine. She was empty. It's amazing how bitterness and pain can make us see things in a different way than they actually were. It's amazing how regret and bitterness can change how we perceive the past. Pain and loss and loneliness and bitterness and heartache can affect how we see everything. And we think the past was better than it was. We look at the past through rose-tinted glasses. Israel do that when they come out of Egypt and they get a little bit hungry in the wilderness and they say, would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they forget that they were slaves there. And very often in life, we walk away from things that we know are bad, expecting everything to be perfect. But when everything doesn't become perfect overnight, we start to look back and go, maybe it wasn't so bad after all. You have a girl or a wife who gets out of an abusive relationship or an abusive marriage. But then on a Saturday night at 10:30, when she's sitting on her own, she starts to think to herself, he wasn't that bad after all. Maybe I should go back there. Somebody gets out of a job because it was horrendous. It was completely crushing their soul. But they're in a new job, and in the first 3 months, they're struggling to get to grips with it. And they start to think, maybe that old job wasn't so bad. At least they knew what to do. You leave a church because the teaching was flaky or wishy-washy. It was like candy floss every week. There was no bread in the house. But then you go to a new church and somebody says something that you don't like once, and you go, maybe that old church wasn't so bad after all. It's amazing how we can distort the reality of the past. We view the past as better than the present and the future. And we view the present and the future as worse than it actually is. And Naomi's bitter. She's bitter at God. She's bitter at life. And she says, I'm empty. She says, I've got nothing. She says, life is hopeless. She says, I've got nothing. I've come back empty. I've got nothing. And poor Ruth standing here. Ruth, who has left everything to be with her. And Ruth's probably thinking, you've got me. But as far as Naomi's concerned, she's got absolutely nothing because she misses the provision that God has put right in front of her. Because when we're bitter and when we're broken and when we're hurt, we can miss the provision that God has right in front of us. Do you know any bitter people? They're fun to be around, aren't they? You know what I've discovered with bitter people? They don't want to get better. Have you ever tried to talk somebody who's bitter into getting better? Have you ever tried to convince them to let go of their bitterness? Good luck to you. They will hold on to their bitterness for dear life. They deserve their anger and pain as far as they're concerned. And they can't imagine anything will ever change. Things will never get better. They're so busy living in the pain of their history that they can never imagine a better destiny. Yet God, when we are empty, you know what the best thing about being empty is? We can be filled. She says, I'm empty. And God says, that's exactly where I need you to be right now. Because you're empty of all the things that you put your hope and your trust in. And when you're empty of all those other things, that's when I can step in and I can fill you. And you know, this is the end of chapter 1. And it's fairly depressing, isn't it? Like I say, it's like an omnibus edition of EastEnders. It's not full of joy. But here's what we need to remember at the end of chapter 1. The story isn't over yet. And what many of us do is we judge the whole book by one chapter. And if this was all there is, it wouldn't be good. But it's not the end of the book. And I want to say to you today that you might be living in a chapter of your life that's not good. A chapter of loss, a chapter of pain, a chapter of bitterness and brokenness, a chapter where people have betrayed you, rejected you, hurt you, a chapter where you feel empty, where you feel depressed, where you feel like nothing's ever going to get better. And I simply want to tell you that that's a chapter, but it's not the end of a book. I put a photo up in the last few days on social media. If you'd put it up there for me. 2016, I did what I call my prison break haircut. Some people called it a Britney. Remember, she shaved her head. And when I did that, you know, I wasn't in a good place. I wasn't in a healthy place. If you look in my eyes there, they're kind of sad and empty and vacant. That was probably when I hit the lowest place in my, and some of you have heard me talk about just when I was burnt out and empty and exhausted. And when I was in that place with my Britney haircut, I actually called it my prison break haircut because I just wanted to escape. When I was in that place, you know, I wasn't sure I ever wanted to lead a church again. I wasn't sure God ever wanted me to lead a church again. I wasn't sure I ever wanted to preach again. I wasn't sure I'd ever do ministry again. I wasn't sure God could ever use me again. But that was just a chapter. That was just a chapter in the story. And it wasn't the end of the story. And if I've discovered anything, it's this: that God is able to write the rest of your future different than that bad chapter if you will let him. That if you will allow God, if you will follow God, if you will cling to God like Ruth clung to Naomi and say, wherever you go, I will go. I'm not leaving your side. I'm just going to go where you go. Then the end of the book can be very different than that chapter. And so if you're in a bad chapter today, let me say to you, I've been there. But your bad chapter is not the end of the book. And if you're in a really good chapter today, let me also say this. There'll be the odd bad chapter along the way. Enjoy the good ones. Endure the bad ones. Persevere through them. But ultimately, I've read the end of the story. And his story and my story end in glory. And therefore, wherever he goes, I will go. No matter what. Because wherever he is the right place to be.